My name is Preston So. I use he, him, they, them pronouns, and today I'm going to be talking a little bit about some of the trends in software architecture from a bit more of a bird's eye perspective when it comes to building for the web and also building for things that go well beyond the web. Just before I get started, though, I want to get a sense of who's here in the room. So how many of you work with JavaScript or with frameworks like React, Angular, Vue.js? Perfect. How many of you work with content management systems, CMSs, commerce systems, or other software of that nature? Okay. And how many of you do that in a headless paradigm? You basically use the JavaScript frameworks to consume data from CMSs or from commerce systems? Okay. And also, how many of you work with editors, content creators, marketing teams, QA people who have to work on the other side of the technology? Okay, perfect. Great mix of people in the room. So what I'm going to talk about today is some of the trends that have been happening in the course of the last few years, especially over the course of COVID in particular, that have changed the way that we look at how to serve other personas that are in our jurisdiction. So not just the people who are part of our developer teams, but how we interact with and interface with those who are not developers, but are just as important to the success of our collective technology. Before I move on, though, let me introduce myself. As I mentioned, I'm Preston So. I'm the author of several books. If you've heard of the Gatsby.js framework, I wrote the first ever comprehensive guide to Gatsby.js. I also am a member of the Drupal community. Oh yeah, how many of you work with like Sitefinity here? I know this is a Progress conference. So I'm curious how Progress focused. Okay, gotcha. I don't know anything about Sitefinity, just FYI. So I don't know anything about that stuff, but I do know a lot about the Drupal, WordPress worlds, sort of the PHP world, a little bit less about the .NET world. So I also wrote a book last year about voice content strategy and voice content design, which is something that was my first kind of foray into UX. I currently work at Oracle, where I work on our product strategy for our Oracle content management system. So, just some quick ads about my books: Voice Content Usability, Gatsby the Definitive Guide, and also Decoupled Drupal in Practice. All three of these are available right now on bookshelves. Here's what we're going to talk about today. And if there are, I think there's a few of you who have never heard of the term headless or might be a little bit less familiar with headless. So let me dive into a definition of what exactly we mean by headless or decoupled software. I want to dive into some of the issues that revolve around headless. Today, headless or decoupled software architecture is really the predominant way to do a lot of the work that we do as web developers, that we do as engineers when it comes to integrating our JavaScript frameworks or integrating other digital experiences with the marketing platforms, the MarTech tools, the content management systems, the commerce management systems that increasingly dictate how other teams interact with our technology. So I'll talk a little bit about what some of the problems are. How many of you have heard the term low code or no code here in the room? Okay, good. So there's a lot of traction right now, a lot of commentary, a lot of conversation happening right now in the industry about how developers have made it, we developers have made it very difficult for other people to kind of get involved in creating websites, creating web applications, creating mobile applications in ways that make sense to them. And that's why the low-code movement, the no-code movement has become such a prominent fixture lately right now in the discourse, particularly around tools like Webflow, for instance, which has been very popular over the last few years. But what is headless or decoupled software? So if you're a computer science nerd, if you're somebody who studied computer science, the actual base level definition of headless software is software that does not have a graphical user interface, a GUI. It doesn't have a visual component. You interact with it through non-visual means. There is no user interface. But today, the term headless has taken on a very different meaning. It's not just kind of this notion of a command line interface or something that doesn't have a visual GUI. It's really about the way that we architect these components of software together and how they work together to yield certain outcomes in the service of the digital experiences that we want to produce, the technologies that we want to create, and also the user problems that we want to solve. But one really good example of decoupled software, decoupled technology, is actually in the movie The Martian starring Matt Damon. If you think of Earth as one contiguous unit, a monolith, and if you've heard the term monolithic architecture or monolithic software, that's where we're going right now. The thing with monolithic software is that you can't really separate it apart. There's no way to take all those layers that are wrapped up in that piece of software and completely separate those things out into different components and only use, let's say, one or two of the components that are present in that technology. And this is true of a large number of tools that have been part of our wheelhouse as developers over the past few decades. One of the things that we know from satellites and from bases on other planets and other spatial bodies is that we can actually communicate with those particular celestial bodies through probes and through communications and through different signals that we can use, namely things like requests and responses. Now, if you're a developer, this is probably very, very easy stuff. This is very, very rudimentary stuff. So let's move into another example of this, which is that headless or decoupled software is really meant to serve what are called consumer applications. Some pedants might call this client applications, which I try to avoid because it really kind of overlaps a little too much with the notion of client-side applications or client-side technology, which is a very different kind of idea, especially in today's web discourse. But the fundamental issue that we want to talk about today is that headless software fundamentally represents a complete disintegration of the monolith in software, which means that now you have a variety of different applications and a variety of different systems that can interact with and communicate with one another solely through the means of HTTP requests or what are called API requests. So for example, a headless content management system, a headless commerce system, this could be a database, for example, that you've got on a server somewhere, is going to communicate with a consumer application that you've built in Angular or React or Vue.js solely through the means of these HTTP requests. With me so far? So APIs, obviously, this is a very important term as well, but APIs are very fundamental to how we think about these systems because they are the communication layer. They are the sort of reason why all of these things work together. And if we think about the notion of our JavaScript frameworks, our applications, our mobile apps, our web apps, as being solely presentation layers that do nothing more than allow us to manipulate and see the data that we're actually using and looking at, that makes a lot of sense within the context of how we think about the front end as being the very topmost layer of our software stack. There's a notion in software architecture, obviously, called separation of concerns. And many of you have probably heard of this term before. It's a very fundamental term to how we think about how to effectively design software architecture. And that is that you want to really distinguish very clearly within the very construction of your software where the different ideas and concepts of your data occur. So if it's talking about manipulating that data, transforming that data for presentation, rather than actually templating that data into that presentation layer, there's a separation of concerns between those two particular fundamental concerns that allows for us to really think about these software systems in a much more kind of distributed way or a much more clean way than we were able to before. And for developers, headless offers the promise of front-end freedom. After all, many of us have probably used in the past content management systems or other tools that have been very restrictive in how you can interact with the code underlying the front-end development of your various user experiences and applications. Chances are you might have only been able to use certain HTML tags or certain JavaScript or only certain syntax because the tool restricted your ability to do those things. And that's why so many of us as developers have adopted these JavaScript frameworks, not just because they use the latest and greatest in syntax, not just because they use the latest and greatest that's coming out ever since all of the development that started with ES 2015. Now, we have more front-end freedom that allows us to do a lot more with our code and customize our applications in a much more sophisticated way. So monolithic separation of concerns is really fundamentally this notion of, well, if it's a monolith, you can't separate the database, you can't separate the data layer from the presentation layer. But today, with headless applications, you can do that precisely. And many of these headless software applications today that are very popular in the content management and commerce management worlds are now focusing on the notion of, well, let's go ahead and really enforce this headless separation of concerns from the very get-go, as opposed to enforcing a monolithic separation of concerns that actually makes very little sense in the grand scheme of how today we build software for web experiences and beyond. Now, this is a really, really fundamental thing, which is that a lot of headless CMSs today, if you've ever used headless content management systems like Sanity or like Contentful, if you've ever used headless commerce systems like Commerce Tools, for instance, all of these approaches, all of these new tools that have emerged over the last few years have actually gotten rid of the presentation layer entirely as a fundamental component of the actual software itself. And today there's also, of course, the notion of universal JavaScript or isomorphic JavaScript, which is something that I've diagrammed here showing, for example, Drupal as a data source, which is a CMS that's available. But the fundamental issue that we're discussing now, of course, as web developers, is that a lot of the previous ways that we built web architectures were rooted in a server-side driven approach where you only had a server-side rendering process. But now, in addition to a server-side rendering process, we also have a client-side rendering process that occurs asynchronously. So in today's JavaScript applications and in today's world, certain things that are static, certain things that are unchanging, those components of your web page that really don't need to evolve or don't need to be dynamic, we render those first. But then, once we actually have that component in place, then we actually go through and do things like authenticated content or personalized content or actual private content or secure content that requires us to have some sort of a dynamic interaction with a server. And that, of course, allows us to perform server-side rendering for that particular content in the process of doing that server-side rendering process. But then later on, if we need to have even more dynamic content appear, we can do deferred rendering on the client side and do that entirely using, of course, approaches like Ajax and WebSockets and so on and so forth. But for content and commerce teams, the promise of headless is totally different. So for us as developers, this unleashes a whole lot of innovation, a whole lot of new ground that we can explore when it comes to DevOps, CI/CD, when it comes to hosting, when it comes to how we build applications. But when you think about the people that are our customers, when you think about the people who are using our services and saying, hey, just build me a web app, they're not thinking about the distinction between React and Vue. They're not thinking about the distinction between deferred client-side rendering and async and sync. What they're thinking about is omnichannel delivery. And this is a really important kind of notion. And when you think about the architecture or the map a lot of these folks have in their heads, what they're actually thinking about is something like this picture. Yes, of course, you can support things like Gatsby and Vue.js and Angular and React and what have you, but they're really also concerned about how they're going to support their iOS mobile app, how they're going to support their voice interface on Alexa or on a Google Home device, how they're going to support a Unity-driven virtual reality or augmented reality application that is another thing that goes well beyond the websites that we are building today. How many of you have built anything that is outside of the realm of JavaScript, like mobile, using Swift, Objective-C, doing anything with potentially AR, VR? Has anyone built anything with Unity, for example, that consumes web data? So this is where a lot of today's customers that are hiring us are moving next, is to those worlds where we, frankly, as web developers, have a little bit less experience, but they still want that architectural understanding of exactly where their data is going to end up. Now, there's a big distinction between a headless kind of system and a hybrid headless system. And Oracle Content Management, which is the tool that I work on, is a hybrid headless system, which means that you can have a built-in presentation layer, a built-in website builder that is part of the overarching system, but also enforces and enables a headless separation of concerns that allows for us to incorporate all of these other consumers in the process. But I argue that this doesn't go far enough. This doesn't actually go that far, because one of the things that a lot of our marketing teams, a lot of our editorial teams, a lot of our content teams, a lot of our commerce teams, those who are building the product pages, those who are creating the landing pages on websites, those who are dictating what the navigation bar needs to look like in our web applications, what they really want is an ability to see the overarching milieu of their content or commerce or data and customer data within a singular context that allows for them to be not disenfranchised. What I mean by that is, let's say that you build a web application in React. And let's say that somebody wants to preview their new headline or their new navigation bar within that particular web app. It takes a lot of DevOps thinking, a lot of CI/CD thinking, a lot of deployment knowledge to be able to accomplish that using unpublished data or using privileged data for users who don't actually understand anything about how any of those things work. What they want to be able to do is to just click a button that says preview and see their previewed content live without ever having to worry about any of the underlying technology. And that's what a lot of these systems enabled in the past. If you think about the monolithic systems that existed in the early 2000s, the late 1990s, if you go as far back as movable type, for example, or expression engine, some of these very, very ancient tools, those were predicated on the notion of, I can hit a preview button, I can see the content that I've just written before it goes live, and then I can then publish it live. But today, because of this new omnichannel explosion, a lot of these teams are becoming very disenfranchised. And it's because we've built a lot of this software biased towards the web. We've not really thought about the fact that a lot of our a lot of our content, a lot of our commerce data, a lot of our customer data doesn't just travel through the heralded links and the vaunted URL structures of decades past. Because today, what we're dealing with increasingly is other types of content, other types of data that flow through different kinds of interfaces that you might not ever interact with orally. Voice interfaces, for example, are an example of headless software because they don't have a graphical user interface. If you interact with your Amazon Alexa device or if you interact with your Google Home, there is fundamentally no screen that allows you to interact with that content or that data in a way that makes sense to visual users of computers or of smartphones. And similarly, as we move into more of the augmented reality, virtual reality, Internet of Things landscape, one of the things that we're increasingly seeing as well is that links are not necessarily the only thing that dictates how our data changes and what data we see. Now we know that changes in position, changes in orientation, how we actually interact with a space, with an environment, becomes a very important fixture of how we think about this. And this is a very big question right now because there's a lot of debate right now happening around the web industry about low-code tools. Low-code obviously meaning that you as somebody who is not a developer, who doesn't write any code, who doesn't know anything about CLIs, who doesn't know anything about React or anything about how to use classes and use any of the syntax that we know in JavaScript, especially modern JavaScript today, can actually create a website or a web application or a mobile application from scratch. But the issue, of course, is that a lot of these other interfaces that people want, that our customers want, that are being sought out, like virtual reality interfaces and voice applications, are still not things that the lay customer can use, with a few very small exceptions. There was, for example, a few years ago, a tool called Layar, which was the first ever content management system specifically focused on augmented reality applications. So you see that a lot of the things that we're dealing with today are really an effect of and a consequence of the complexity that this omni-channel direction has enforced for us in the rearview mirror. Increasingly, what headless means, what omni-channel means, is that we have to think about how to build low-code and no-code, not just for the web, not just things like front page or Fireworks back in the day, or things like Webflow today, but also how to enable that for all of the different kinds of digital environments that we know our customers want to see data. And what it's led to, and I've had the privilege to work on a variety of voice applications and immersive applications that use the same data as websites and web apps for the same company. This leads to a lot of custom workflows and a lot of problematic patterns, a lot of issues and paradigms that really are kind of hacked on, are very ad hoc, instead of the established patterns that we're really used to, like dev, stage, prod. For these applications that we've built, CI/CD. Also established patterns like draft and publish states for things like commerce data and content data. So headless ostensibly satisfies the need for these omni-channel destinations, but it doesn't really actually do a very good job. And what I argue for, and if you check out my blog at preston.so, I've written pages and pages for CMS Wire as well about the notion of what I call distributed architectures for content and commerce, where we stop thinking about these other consumers, like React, for example, or Angular, or even AR/VR or Amazon Alexa, as being these separate little islands over there in the middle of the ocean, and instead fully integrate them into how we think about how content and commerce architecture should be built from the ground up. And this is something that a lot of people in the industry have actually done and thought about to a great extent. Adobe, for example, not to call out somebody who is in the marketplace, but Adobe has actually really focused on the notion of somebody being able to manage within the same tool both their websites and their mobile applications. This is not a revolutionary idea. And there is quite a lot of argument in favor of being able to manage a virtual reality interface, a Unity interface, a voice interface, all of those things, a chatbot, a text bot, all in the same context as you build your data and you manage your data for your website, for your web app, for your mobile app. And this is the fundamental kind of issue that a lot of the content and commerce tools are now facing. We need a new grand compromise because a lot of the implementations that we work with, a lot of the things that we do for our customers, when we build e-commerce tools for them, when we build shopping carts and checkout flows for them, when we build these article presentation layers for them and URL structures for them, is that we have to think about all of these different characters in the story that allow them to have that control, have that manipulability over those non-web experiences, which also includes things like JavaScript. Because of the fact that JavaScript is a dynamic language, because of the fact that we can manipulate the client side so easily, it's very challenging to understand, well, how can we actually understand in the same way that we were able to with HTML and CSS, the way that we can have other people who are not developers manage that data? And one of the big issues that we see today, and I think this is true across not just content and commerce management, but also across the entire industry, is that when it comes to a lot of the marketing teams that we have to work with, the content teams, the editorial teams, those who are not writing code on a daily basis, they are able to manipulate just these two bottom things on the screen. But developers are the only ones who have access to really manipulating things like a smartphone camera with a mobile app. They don't have the need to, go in and kind of learn that code of how to access that hardware, or learning how Unity works, for example. These are things that developers can do, but that the people that we serve still fundamentally can't do. And we've solved this lower tier of these issues. We've solved these problems for websites and responsive design, but we haven't solved those for Roku applications and so on and so forth. A few years ago, I showed this graph, and this graph was part of my presentation at DrupalCon Vienna, and it caused a lot of kind of chatter in the audience, because one of the things that, and it's been adopted also by several other people in the commerce and content world, what this depicts, and this is a more kind of clearer and revised version of it, is that when we think about our developer experience, that's only one facet of all of the different user experiences of our implementations, of our software architectures that we have to think about. And if we think about the fact that there's now a proliferation of channels, of conduits for our data that we have to serve, namely AR, VR, IoT, websites, mobile apps, what have you, React, Angular, what have you, at that same time, we're going to have a lot of people who are on the other side, who are the other half of the back office, getting concerned about the fact that they no longer have the ability to manipulate and manage the data in the same way that they were able to before. So we have this kind of dual pressure going on that really reduces the effectiveness of the user experience of the software architectures that we build for everybody, and not just for some folks. And there's also this new term emerging called the digital experience platform. A lot of companies have adopted it, that really have to play with this problem of what happens when we move from one single digital experience, which has been canonically the website, the proverbial website, to many different digital experiences, potentially dozens, for example, and not just a single one. How do you preview data for a voice application or an augmented reality interface? How do you move a content item or a commerce product from a draft state to an in-review state so you can actually see how it looks in a digital sign, potentially, that you can interact with using QR codes, or that you can actually use an AR application for to see it in front of you in your very home as opposed to within a brick-and-mortar environment? How do you do things like compliance reviews? And this is a huge concern for folks who work in healthcare, for example, thanks to HIPAA compliance, or even in the European Union with GDPR compliance. Many of these situations involve compliance officers and reviewers who have to be able to see how a headline looks, or how a paragraph looks, or how a product page looks before it goes live. But that's no longer adequate with just a website preview. We got to be able to think about also things like mobile apps and so on and so forth. So headless systems, and how we think about headless systems, must aim to restore that balance that we aimed at and achieved before, where many of our users, many of our customers were able to see a lot of this data in the ways that they wanted to, and today they can't. And this is very true not just of people who are using headless systems that are already available there in the market, that are already widely used, but also many of us who still use our own custom-built headless architectures or software architectures. This equilibrium is something that is very tenuous because of the fact that in large companies, this is often split across so many different departments and so many different stakeholders. Today we're seeing a bit of a bifurcation in the market where certain monolithic systems have a reputation now of being more manageable or more easy to use from an editorial perspective. And then from a developer perspective, they're less easy to use and they're less effective for the purposes of developer experience. For headless, however, it's the opposite. For headless, developer experience is very good, but the actual user experience of people who are interacting with the tool is actually much lower and much less effective. And this is causing a bifurcation in the market, which is very, very tough to deal with, because what it's going to lead to is a situation where we now have different tools that are completely scattered across this spectrum, and many of the tools that we have today will simply become inadequate for many users. We'll potentially even have a complete fragmentation of how we think about these content and commerce systems. Now, that might not necessarily be a bad thing. But for a lot of the buyers that we deal with, a lot of the CMOs or CTOs, or a lot of the folks who are CIOs who are dealing with these buying decisions, these purchasing decisions, and hiring us, for example, as agencies or as service providers to really interact with these tools, it becomes a very, very significant issue with a lot of zeros in the checkbook. What I argue for is for us to really move away from the monolithic model, because it's acknowledged now among all of us in the developer community that this is simply not the best way to build web products today. Building something using a single system that manages your HTML and CSS for you, but has no ability to interact in a very dynamic way with your JavaScript that you've written in React, your JSX components in React, or some of your services in Angular. These are things that are fundamentally very important to us as developers, and we're not going to just let them go. What we need to do is to really think about now the fact that, well, headless is now the way that a lot of developers today are moving, and this is the way that the world is going to be moving over the next few years. How do we bring everyone else along who's in our companies? How do we bring everyone else along who's in our customers and needs to be able to manipulate this data and see this data in ways that they were with the website era? So right now, we've got this situation, obviously, where a lot of the headless tools are simply not equipped with what's necessary for editors and for marketing teams and for compliance teams and QA teams that are focused on not the technology but the content to be able to see all of these things and manage all of these things in the same way. They have to tap on our shoulders. They have to say, hey, can you figure out how to let me see this, staging version of this chatbot? But they don't even know the language they have to use to enable that to work. It's really fundamentally a still very deep DevOps concern. And this is the fundamental problem facing a lot of this, what I call digital experience management or digital experience platforms today, is that we don't have an easy way to think about how a lot of these other teams will understand what we talk about when it comes to CI/CD for JavaScript or DevOps for JavaScript or DevOps and CI/CD for all of the other things that have completely different and foreign infrastructures to what we build with today. For example, if you're building on Unity, if you're building for app stores, it's a totally different approach to CI/CD and also to deployment. And the web, fundamentally, when you think about the fact that we've built on these tools, if you've worked with some of those ancient tools like Movable Type or Expression Engine, if you've worked with things like Front Page or Fireworks, there's always been this kind of uneasy alliance between people where, hey, it'll spit out something that me as a developer can actually go in and manipulate, even though the stuff that came out of Front Page was awful, for those of you who were around back in those days. But the web has always been built on this very uneasy kind of equilibrium between personas, and now we're seeing that as we move into a more complex and a more multifaceted landscape architecturally and digitally, we're seeing now that that uneasy balance is falling apart. Because beyond the web especially, as we move into things that go beyond React, let's say we go into React Native, things that go beyond, let's say, AngularJS, we go into Angular Universal. A lot of these people who were able to do a lot of the things that they were able to do before simply cannot anymore. And one of the big issues is the editorial control. So there's a term, obviously, that we all probably know when it comes to tools like FrontPage or Fireworks, which is WYSIWYG. What you see is what you get, which is that anytime you drag stuff around or move a component in or resize a part of the page, that is what you get as the outcome. And a lot of people who are on the editorial side of our software have gotten very used to this notion. And this is a very common model that exists in monolithic content and commerce tools. You can go in, you can resize things, you can drag and drop layouts, you can drag and drop components, and what you see is what you get. But how does that work when a lot of the things that we built for those purposes and a lot of the things that we knew were very important for those purposes are no longer possible? How do you do a drag and drop layout builder for a voice application? How do you do a drag and drop layout builder for a virtual reality experience? But we need to enable some level of editors to be able to see these things and to be able to be capable of managing some of this data and seeing this data and deploying this data themselves. And that's where I'm going to move next, which is, okay, I've given, I think, us the lay of the land of how we as developers think about headless and how we think about the way that the world is moving. But how do we think about everyone beyond developers in ways that make sense to them? Authentic omnichannel, like true omnichannel, requires a conjunct of workflows. It's not just about a single workflow on a web content management system or a web commerce system, but we need to enable both editorial teams and developer teams in ways that achieve a happy medium. Obviously, there's many frameworks for this. There's the hierarchy of needs, which is a very popular sociological model. And one of the things that is true is that a lot of people who are marketing teams, a lot of people who are editors have different needs and different requirements for certain digital experiences over others. And that will evolve over time, of course, as demands change and as tools mature. But one example of this is that I've spoken to a lot of folks, a lot of my clients that I've consulted for in places like India and Japan and in the US. And a lot of their concerns are really not about achieving this kind of true front page level WYSIWYG or achieving this true drag and drop layout builder. They just want to do the very bare minimum and the very bare foundational aspect of seeing their unpublished data before it goes live in some kind of a previewed context. And user research obviously is very important. But the problem is that a lot of these things are distinguished across the things that we're building, those artifacts that we're actually producing. JavaScript, for example, has a very, very high threshold for what our editorial teams want and what our content teams and commerce teams want. Whereas something like digital signage, which might use something like AWS IoT or might use something totally different, for example, might be an Angular app that's just being projected onto a screen, that might have a very different kind of threshold for what people want. There's a lot of folks who are currently working on kind of this kind of user research, looking at what is it that the marketing team or the editorial team or that compliance team needs to be able to feel like they have that re-enfranchised sense of what they were able to do before. At Oracle, I've been working on this notion of headless orchestration. And I've been really toying with this term called continuous proofing, continuous publishing, which is really the editorial analog, the editorial equivalent of what we think of as CI/CD. Because the fundamental question we have to answer, not only for the tools that we already buy or use, but also for the custom workflows and the custom architectures that we've built, is how do we enable those non-negotiable needs? Because neither headless or hybrid headless, as I mentioned before, is the silver bullet. So one of the things that we know is that we as developers very seldom, especially if we're building in a company or building for a client, we have to work with them to understand their needs and build a custom tailored or a very, very tightly curated solution that works for them. And our new grand compromise is going to involve a lot of novel workflows, novel approaches, novel architectures that don't exist today and simply are going to go well beyond the paradigms that we have today to explain a lot of these things and summarize a lot of these things. But there is one thing over the past few years, obviously, that has changed the developer experience forever and has been a huge source of innovation for us as developers in the industry, and that is CI/CD. And I argue that there's something that we can do for editors, which is really about enabling more continuous proofing, expanding that notion of what CI/CD does for developers in ways that are understandable and manipulable by editors. How cool would it be if you, as somebody who doesn't write a line of code, could actually preview your own data, and then push it live and deploy it without ever having to understand anything about how that infrastructure works. That's the promise of what CI/CD does for us, and that's the promise of what CI/CD extended to its logical conclusion can do for our customers. Obviously, one of the most famous examples of this is in journalism, continuous proofing, where many newspapers today, to avoid this mistake where Harry Truman was mistakenly announced as the loser of the presidential election, and of course, the papers were already off the presses, and the Chicago Daily Tribune had to own up to their mistake later on, but they fundamentally made a mistake by not issuing the correct headline. Today, a lot of people, especially in websites, are very careful about deploying the correct page that shows the correct Super Bowl winner, or potentially not revealing, let's say, the death of a very famous monarch before it's actually happened. This actually happened just a few months ago. A newspaper in Brazil accidentally published an obituary for Queen Elizabeth well before, of course, her recent death. And there's two types of headless development that exist today, which is that a lot of these executives don't want to lose what they have in their legacy tools, but then there's also a lot of us who are part of large developer teams, part of large engineering teams, that can build a lot of these things ourselves. The problem with continuous deployment, of course, is the fact that for the editor, it's a black box. For somebody who needs to understand the data and work with the data as opposed to deploying it, it's a really black box. A lot of the editors, a lot of the people that we work with on marketing teams and content teams and commerce teams don't understand how these deployments work and how code deployments work, how data deployments work. And this leads to a lot of high friction collaboration, a lot of tension, a lot of issues where a lot of our teammates are really confused, and there's a lot of back and forth on Slack and frustration about deployment, about actually deploying things live and actually moving things from dev stage to prod in ways that the teams that actually pay us the money to do these things understand. What I mean by continuous proofing is to allow for us to create not just the new previews of our applications that we're building with code, but also to do that with data in ways that are completely transparent to our editorial teams and to our stakeholders. Now, this can take shape in a variety of different ways, because one of the things that we want to do as well is to do this in a context that those editors and those users will understand. What that means is, if we're building a mobile application, we have to create some way or some kind of emulator or some kind of internal low-fidelity tool that allows for users to be able to see their data within a mobile app without ever having to actually pull out their smartphone or go and download something off of an app store or go into the iOS simulator. And similarly with things like virtual reality, we want to allow for people to be able to see those things within the tool that they're using. When I was at Acquia, which is the Drupal company that creates the Drupal CMS, we worked on actually a virtual reality preview tool within the context of the content management system. And it's these kinds of tools and these kinds of approaches that will lead to the sorts of innovation that we want to see in the future. And of course, what that means is we now have this much less high friction approach that allows for a lot of the users that previously saw these things as just black boxes, had no idea what was going on, was totally obscure to them, can now understand exactly where things are headed. Now, there's a lot of things that this can benefit, and this is really depicting a lot of Oracle tools that we have within our Oracle cloud infrastructure, allowing for people to really engage in these very complex and very expressive workflows that allow for them to interact with, obviously, their data in ways that go well beyond what the web is capable of today. But because we're running out of time here, let me really switch over to kind of the demonstration of what we're building. And then I'll also quickly go and take some questions. So this is our Oracle Content Management system. This is the a tool known as Oracle Content Management. It's a little bit, this is actually an initial demo that's not 100% stable. But one of the things I'm going to do is I'm going to scrub ahead here so you can see. Now, my website, Preston.so, is a Gatsby website. And of course, if you know anything about Gatsby.js, it's not in any way HTML or CSS in ways that a normal website builder would be able to actually touch and handle. So what we're doing here is we actually see a fully functional preview of the production Gatsby.js application within the context of the content management system. What's going to happen here is I'm going to update this headline, which is part of this page. And then you'll see how it just automatically triggers a new preview, notifies me of that new preview, and allows for me to actually see that content in an unpublished form before it goes live. I'm going to skip ahead a little bit because some of this is just data entry. But as you can see here, because we have richer integration with other DevOps tools, and this is something that I think is very important. One of the things that I think a lot of especially enterprise companies are a little bit worried about is, well, hey, there's so many other infrastructure tools out there. We don't want to integrate with them because that's going to cause problems later on where, we don't want to be actually giving into, let's say, people that might be competing against us. I believe, though, that that's a wrong-footed approach because fundamentally today, one of the most important considerations for us as people who work in this industry is that our tools are no longer just a single suite of tools from one single company. We're now using things like Netlify or Vercel for potentially 2 different sites that might be doing different kinds of CI/CD or different kinds of deployments. We're using different mobile app tools. We're using different frameworks. And we're using also potentially hosting companies that are focused on a single framework, like Gatsby Cloud, for instance, or Vercel, which does Next.js. And of course, this leads to a notion of, well, this is how we all need to work together and be that tide that lifts all boats. But as you can see here, there's now, the preview has now been deployed. And now me, as somebody who doesn't know anything about this stuff, and we're still working obviously on this user interface, can now see the new version of my content in the context of my actual application without ever leaving the context of the content management system that I use. So this is still early days for the tool that we're building, but the fundamental lesson that I wanted to share with all of you is that this is the sort of thinking that increasingly, as we work with more and more complex architectures, more and more complex demands from our customers, that we're going to increasingly have to deal with in the context of what we build and how we build for them. So that was it. Let me just skip to the key takeaways here. Headless tools obviously haven't done enough to bridge that gap between developers and other teams. It's not really anyone's fault, but we do need to work on fixing that, whether we are people who work at these software companies or we're working as freelancers or independent service providers for, obviously, the customers that we work with. We can't leave any personas behind, and we have to think about how to democratize these headless tools and allow for low-code and no-code, those promises that we've made, to extend well beyond the web. And by thinking about some of these ideas that really extend the notion of CI/CD into the worlds that our customers and our non-developer friends are going to be more familiar with, this will lead to a huge amount of change and a huge amount of innovation for how we think about our customer experiences in the future. And low-code's next challenge, of course, is to restore the equilibrium that first drove it to success with website tools and website builders in the first place. So I've written a lot about this. I've written pages and pages and pages about this. If you want to check it out, I've got a blog, Preston.so. I've also written about this in CMS Wire, and it goes into a lot more detail about some of these things. You can see more about what I just talked about as well within those pieces of content. So thank you very much.